The Agony and the Ecstasy by FRANK&STERN. The Lover and the Sculptor. The best of artists hath no thought to show which the rough stone in its superfluous shell doth not include. To break the marble spell is all the hand that serves the brain can do. The artist and his work. How can that be, lady, which all men learn by long experience? Shapes that seem alive, wrought in hard mountain marble, will survive their maker, whom the years to dust return. Beauty and the Artist. Beauteous art, brought with us from heaven, will conquer nature. So divine a power belongs to him who strives with every nerve. If I was made for art from childhood, given a prey for burning beauty to devour, I blame the mistress I was born to serve. Michelangelo Buonarroti. Book 1. The Studio. He sat before the mirror of the second-floor bedroom, sketching his lean cheeks with their high-bone ridges, the flat, broad forehead, and ears too far back on the head, the dark hair curling forward in thatches, the amber-colored eyes, wide-set but heavy-lidded. "I'm not well designed," thought the 13-year-old with serious concentration. "My head is out of rule, with the forehead overweighing my mouth and chin. Someone should have used a plumb line." He shifted his wiry body lightly so as not to waken his 4 brothers sleeping behind him, then cocked an ear toward the Via del Angelera to catch the whistle of his friend Granacci. With rapid strokes of the crayon, he began redrafting his features, widening the oval of the eyes, rounding the forehead, broadening the narrow cheeks, making the lips fuller, the chin larger. "There," he thought. "Now I look better. Too bad a face can't be redrawn before it's delivered, like plans for the facade of the Duomo." Notes of a bird's song came fluting through the 10-foot window, which he had opened to the cool morning air. He hid his drawing paper under the bolster at the head of his bed, and went noiselessly down the circular stone stairs to the street. His friend Francesco Granacci was a 19-year-old youth, a head taller than himself, with hay-colored hair and alert blue eyes. For a year Granacci had been providing him drawing materials and sanctuary in his parents' home address, the Via de' Benticori, as well as prints borrowed surreptitiously from Ghirlandaio's studio. Though the son of a wealthy family, Granacci had been apprenticed to Filippino Lippi at the age of 10. At 13 had posed as the central figure of the resurrected youth in the St. Peter raising the emperor's nephew, in the Carmine, which Masaccio had left uncompleted, and was now apprenticed to Ghirlandaio. Granacci did not take his own painting seriously, but he had a sharp eye for talent in others. "You're really coming with me this time?" Granacci demanded excitedly. "It's my birthday present to myself." "Good." He took the younger boy's arm, guiding him along the curving Via de' Benticori, which had been built on the oval site of the old Roman Colosseum, past the high walls of the prison of the Stinche. Remember what I told you about Domenico Ghirlandaio. I've been apprenticed to him for 5 years, and I know him well. Be humble. He likes his apprentices to appreciate him. By now, they had turned into the Via Gibellina, just above the Gibellina gate, which marked the limits of the second wall of the city. On their left they passed the magnificent stone pile of the Bargello, with its colorful governor's courtyard, and then, after they had turned right on the street of the proconsul, the Pazzi Palace. The younger boy ran his hand lovingly over the irregular, rough-hewn blocks of its walls. "Let's hurry," urged Granacci. "This is the best moment of the day for Ghirlandaio, before he begins his drawing." They went with unmatched strides along the narrow streets, past the street of the old irons, with its stone palaces and exterior flights of carved stone stairs leading to jutting penthouses. They made their way along the Via del Corso, and saw on their right, through the narrow slit of the Via del Tedeldini, a segment of the red-tiled Duomo. And, after another block, on their left, the Palazzo dello Signore, with its arches, windows, and crownings of its tan-stone tower, penetrating the faint sunrise blue of the Florentine sky. To reach Ghirlandaio's studio, they had to cross the square of the old market, where fresh bevies, cut down the backbone and opened wide, hung on pulleys in front of the butcher's stalls. From here it was but a short walk past the street of the painters to the corner of the Via del Tavolini, where they saw the open door of Ghirlandaio's studio. Michelangelo stopped for a moment to gaze at Donatello's marble St. Mark, standing in a tall niche of the Orson Michael. "Sculpture is the greatest art," he exclaimed, his voice ringing with emotion. Granacci was surprised that his friend had concealed this feeling for sculpture during their 2 years of friendship. "I don't agree with you," he said quietly, "but stop gaping. There's business to be done." The boy took a deep breath. Together they entered the Ghirlandaio workshop. The studio was a large, high-ceilinged room with a pungent smell of paint and charcoal. In the center was a rough plank table set up on horses, around which half a dozen sleepy young apprentices crouched on stools. In a near corner, a man was grinding colors in a mortar, while along the side walls were stacked color cartoons of complicated frescoes. The Last Supper of the Church of the Ognissanti, and the calling of the first apostles for the Sistine Chapel in Rome. In a protected rear corner, on a raised platform, sat a man of about 40, his wide-topped desk, the only ordered spot in the studio, with its neat rows of pens, brushes, sketchbooks, its scissors and other implements hanging on hooks, and behind, on the wall shelves, volumes of illuminated manuscripts. Granacci stopped below his master's desk. "Signor Ghirlandaio, this is Michelangelo, about whom I told you." Michelangelo felt himself being spitted by a pair of eyes reputed to be able to see and record more with one thrust than any artist in Italy. But the boy, too, used his eyes as though they were silver-point pens, drawing for his mind's portfolio the artist sitting above him in an azure coat and red cloak, thrown over the shoulders against the March chill, and wearing a red cap, the sensitive face with its full purple lips, prominent bone formations beneath the eyes, deep cheek hollows, the opulent black hair, parted in the center and worn down to his shoulders, the long supple fingers of his right hand clasped against his throat. He remembered Granacci telling him of Ghirlandaio's exclamation only a few days before. Now that I have begun to understand the ways of this art, it is a grief to me that I am not given the whole circumference of the walls of Florence to cover with fresco. "Who is your father?" demanded Ghirlandaio. "Ludovico di Leonardo Buonarroti Simoni." "I have heard the name. How old are you?" 13. "We start apprentices at 10. Where have you been for the past 3 years?" "Wasting my time at Francesco da Urbino School of Grammar, studying Latin and Greek." A twitching at the corner of Ghirlandaio's dark wine lips showed that he liked the answer. "Can you draw?" "I have the capacity to learn." Granacci wanted to help his friend, but unable to reveal that he had been borrowing Ghirlandaio's prints for Michelangelo to copy, said, "He has a good hand. He made drawings on the walls of his father's house in Settignano. There is one, a satyr." "Ah, a muralist," quipped Ghirlandaio. "Competition for my declining years." Michelangelo was so intense that he took Ghirlandaio seriously. "I've never tried color. It's not my trade." Ghirlandaio started to answer, then checked himself. "Whatever else you may lack for, it isn't modesty. You won't become my competitor, not because you haven't the talent to do so, but because you care nothing for color." Michelangelo felt rather, then heard Granacci's groan beside him. "I didn't mean it that way. You're small for 13. You look too frail for the heavy work of this studio. To draw, one does not need big muscles." He realized that he had been baited into saying the wrong thing, and that in addition he had raised his voice. The apprentices had turned at this contretemps. After a moment, Ghirlandaio, good nature asserted itself. "Very well. Suppose you sketch for me. What will it be?" Michelangelo's eyes traveled over the workshop, swallowing impressions the way country youths break bunches of grapes in their mouths at autumn wine festivals. "Why not the studio?" Ghirlandaio gave a short, disparaging laugh, as though he had been rescued from an awkward position. "Granacci, give Buonarroti paper and charcoal. Now, if you have no objections, I will go back to my work." Michelangelo found a point of vantage near the door from which to see the workshop best, and sat down on the bench to sketch. Granacci lingered by his side. "Why did you have to suggest such a difficult theme? Take plenty of time. He'll forget you're there." His eye and hand were good working partners, grasping the essentials of the large room, the work table in the center with its apprentices on both sides, Ghirlandaio on his platform under the north window. For the first time since entering the studio, his breathing was normal. He felt someone leaning over his shoulder. "I'm not finished," he said. "It is enough." Ghirlandaio took the paper, studied it for a moment. You have worked at another studio. Was it Rosselli's? Michelangelo knew of Ghirlandaio's dislike for Rosselli, who conducted the only other painter's workshop in Florence. 7 years before Ghirlandaio, Botticelli and Rosselli had been called to Rome by Pope Sixtus IV to create wall panels for the newly completed Sistine Chapel. Rosselli had caught the pontiff's eye by using the most garish reds and ultramarine blues and illuminating every cloud, drapery, and tree with gold, and won the coveted prize money. The boy shook his head no. I've drawn in school when Master Urbino wasn't looking, and I've copied after Giotto in Santa Croce, after Masaccio in the Carmine. Mollified, Ghirlandaio said, Granacci was right. You have a strong fist. Michelangelo held his hand in front of him, turning it from back to palm. It is a stone-cutter's hand, he replied proudly. We have little need for stone-cutters in a fresco studio. I'll start you as an apprentice, but on the same terms as though you were 10. You must pay me 6 florins for the first year. I can pay you nothing. Ghirlandaio looked at him sharply. The Buonarroti are not poor country people, since your father wants you apprenticed. My father has beat me every time I mention painting. But I cannot take you unless he signs the Doctors' and Apothecaries' Guild agreement. Why will he not beat you again when you tell him? Because your willingness to accept me will be a defense. That, and the fact that you will pay him 6 florins the first year, 8 the second, and 10 the third. Ghirlandaio's eyelids flared. That's unheard of. Paying money for the privilege of teaching you? Then I cannot come to work for you. It is the only way. The color grinder was swirling his pestle idly in the air while he gazed over his shoulder at the scene. The apprentices at the table made no pretense of working. The master and the would-be apprentice had reversed positions, as though it were Ghirlandaio who needed and wanting Michelangelo had sent for him. Michelangelo could see the no beginning to take form on Ghirlandaio's lips. He stood his ground, his manner respectful both to the older man and to himself, gazing straight at Ghirlandaio, as though to say, It is a thing you should do. I will be worth it to you. Had he shown the slightest weakness, Ghirlandaio would have turned his back on him. But before this solid confrontation, the artist felt a grudging admiration. He lived up to his reputation of being a man lovable and loved by saying, It's obvious we shall never get the Tornabuoni choir finished without your invaluable help. Bring your father in. Out on the Via de' Tavolini once again, with the early morning merchants and shoppers swirling about them, Granacci threw an arm affectionately about the smaller boy's shoulder. You broke every rule, but you got in! Michelangelo flashed his friend one of his rare warming smiles, the amber-colored eyes with their yellow and blue specks sparkling. The smile accomplished the redesigning for which his crayon had groped earlier in front of the bedroom mirror. When parted in a happy smile, his lips were full, revealing strong white teeth, and his chin, thrusting forward, achieved sculptural symmetry with the top half of his face. Three. Walking past the family house of the poet Dante Alighieri and the stone church of the Badia was for Michelangelo like walking through a gallery. For the Tuscan treats stone with the tenderness that a lover reserves for his sweetheart. From the time of their Etruscan ancestors, the people of Fiesole, Settignano, and Florence had been quarreling stone from the mountains, hauling it up by oxen to their land, cutting, edging, shaping, and building it into homes and palaces, churches and loggias, forts and walls. Stone was one of the richest fruits from the Tuscan earth. From childhood they knew its feel and smell, the flavor of its outer shell as well as its inner meat, how it behaved in the hot sun, in the rain, in the full moonlight, in the icy tramontana wind. For 1,500 years their ancestors had worked the native pietra serena stone, building a city of such breathtaking beauty that Michelangelo and generations before him cried, "Never shall I live out of the sight of the Duomo." They reached the carpenter's shop, which occupied the ground floor of the house of the Buonarroti clan, rented in the Via dell'Anguillara. "Arrivederci," as the fox said to the furrier, Granacci twitted. "Oh, I'll take a skinning," he responded grimly, "but unlike the fox, I shall come out alive." He turned the sharp corner of Via de' Benticori, waved to the two horses, whose heads were sticking out of the open-top door of the stable across the street, and climbed the rear staircase to the family kitchen. His stepmother was making her beloved torta. The chickens had been fried in oil earlier in the morning, ground into sausage with onions, parsley, eggs, and saffron. Ham and pork had been made into ravioli with cheese, flour, clove, ginger, and laid with the chicken sausage between layers of pastry, dates, and almonds. The whole dish had then been shaped into a pie and was being covered with dough, preparatory to being placed in the hot embers to bake. "Good morning, Madre mia." "Ah, Michelangelo, I have something special for you today, a salad that sings in the mouth." Lucrezia di Antonio de Sandro Ubaldini da Gagliano's name was longer than the written list of her dowry. Else why should so young a woman marry a 43-year-old graying widower with 5 sons, and cook for a household of 9 Buonarroti? Each morning she rose at 4 o'clock in order to reach the market square at the same time the contadini arrived through the cobbled streets with their pony carts filled with fresh fruits and vegetables, eggs and cheese, meats and poultry. If she did not actually help the peasants unload, at least she lighted their burden by selecting, while the produce was still in the air and before it had a chance to settle in the stalls, the tenderest, slender green beans and piselli peas, unblemished figs, peaches. Michelangelo and his 4 brothers called her Il Migliore, the best, because every ingredient that went into her cooking had to be the best. By dawn she was home, her baskets piled high with capture. She cared little about her clothing, paid no attention to her plain dark face with its suggestion of sideburns and mustache, the lackluster hair pulled tightly back from her brow. But as Michelangelo gazed at her flushed cheeks, the excitement in her eyes as she watched her torta baking, moving with authority and grace from the fire to her majolica jars of spices to sprinkle a fine dust of cinnamon and nutmeg over the crust, knowing every second of the 7-hour morning, precisely where she was on schedule. He saw that she exuded radiance. He knew his stepmother to be a docile creature in every phase of her marriage except the kitchen. Here she was a lioness in the best fighting tradition of the Marzocco, Florence's guardian lion. Wealthy Florence was supplied with exotic foods from all over the world. Aloes, zedori, cardamom, thyme, marjoram, mushrooms and truffles, powdered nuts, galinga. Alas, they cost money to buy. Michelangelo, who shared the bedroom with his 4 brothers next to his parents' room, often heard his parents' pre-dawn debates while his stepmother dressed for marketing. Every day you want a bale of herrings or 1,000 oranges. Lodovico, stop cutting cost with the cheese parer. You are one who would keep money in the purse and hunger in the belly. Hunger? No Buonarroti has missed his dinner in 300 years. Each week, don't I bring you in a fresh veal from Settignano? Why should we eat veal every day when the markets are full of suckling pig and pigeon? On those days that Ludovico lost, he gloomed over the account books, certain that he would not be able to swallow a bite of the bramangiere of fowls, almonds, lard, sugar, cloves, and expensive rice, with which his young, irresponsible wife was ruining him. But slowly, as the fragrances seeped under the door of the kitchen, through the family sitting room, and into his study, it would eat away his fears, his anger, his frustration, and by 11 o'clock he would be ravenous. Lodovico would devour a prodigious dinner, and then push his chair back from the table, slap his bulging viscera with widespread fingers, and exclaim, the one sentence without which the Tuscan day is drear and futile. Ho, mangiato bene! I have eaten well. With this tribute, Lucrezia put away the remains for a light evening supper, set her slavery to wash the dishes and pots, went upstairs, and slept until dark, her day complete, her joy spent. Not so Lodovico, who now went through the inverse process of the morning seduction. As the hours passed, and the food was digested, as the memory of the delicious flavors receded, the gnawing question of how much the elaborate dinner had cost began eating at him, and he was angry all over again. Michelangelo walked through the empty family room, with its heavy oak bench facing the fireplace, the 6-foot bellows propped against the stone, its wall chairs with leather backs and leather seats, all prodigal pieces that had been made by the family's founder. The next room, still overlooking the Via del Pentacorde and the stables, was his father's study, for which Lodovico had built in the downstairs carpenter shop a triangular desk to fit into the 45-degree angle caused by the joining of the 2 streets at this end curve of the old Colosseum. Here Lodovico sat cramped over his gray parchment account books. As long as Michelangelo could remember, his father's sole activity had been a concentration on how to avoid spending money, and how to retain the ragged remnants of the Buonarroti fortune, which had been founded in 1250, and had now shrunk to a 10-acre farm in Settignano, and a house with a legally disputed title, close by this one which they rented. Ludovico heard his son come in and looked up. Nature had been opulent to him in only one gift, his hair. Since it grew freely, he sported a luxurious moustache, which flowed into its beard, cut square 4 inches below his chin. The hair was streaked with gray. Across the forehead were 4 deep straight lines, hard-earned from his years of poring over his account books and family records. His small brown eyes were melancholy with tracing the lost fortunes of the Buonarroti. Michelangelo knew his father as a cautious man who locked the door with 3 keys. "Good morning, Messer Padre." Ludovico sighed. "I was born too late. 100 years ago the Buonarroti vines were tied with sausages." Michelangelo watched his father as he sank into the work reverie of the Buonarroti records, the Old Testament of his life. Ludovico knew to the last florin how much each Buonarroti generation had owned of land, houses, business, gold. This family history was his occupation, and each of his sons in turn had to memorize the legend. "We are noble burghers," Ludovico told them. "Our family is as old as the Medici, Strozzi, or Tornabuoni. The Buonarroti name has lasted 300 years with us." His voice rose with energy and pride. "We have been paying taxes in Florence for 3 centuries. Michelangelo was forbidden to sit in his father's presence without permission, had to bow when given an order. It had been duty rather than interest that led the boy to learn that when the Guelphs took over power in Florence in the middle of the 13th century, their family rose rapidly. In 1260, a Buonarroti was consular for the Guelph army. In 1392, a captain of the Guelph party. From 1343 to 1469, a Buonarroti had 10 times been a member of the Florentine Priori, or city council, the most honored position in the city. Between 1326 and 1475, 8 Buonarroti had been Gonfalonieri, or mayor of the Santa Croce quarter. Between 1375 and 1473, 12 had been among the Buono Uomini, or Council of Santa Croce, including Ludovico and his father Francisco, who were appointed in 1473. The last official recognition of the waning Buonarroti family had taken place 13 years before, in 1474, when Ludovico had been appointed Podesta, or outside visiting mayor, for the combined hamlets of Caprese and Chiusi di Verna, high in the rugged Apennines, where Michelangelo had been born, in the town hall during the family's 6-month residence. Michelangelo had been taught by his father that labor was beneath the noble burgher, but it was the son's observation that Ludovico worked harder in figuring out ways not to spend money than he would have had to work in earning it. Within the Buonarroti fortress, there had remained a few scattered resources, enough to let him eke out his life as a gentleman, providing he spent nothing. Yet in spite of all the skill and dedication Ludovico brought to his task, their capital had dribbled away. Standing in the recessed wall of the 8-foot window, letting the thin March sun warm his bony shoulders, the boy's image went back to their home in Settignano, overlooking the valley of the Arno, when his mother had been alive. Then there had been love and laughter, but his mother had died when he was 6, and his father had retreated in despair into the encampment of his study. For 4 years, while his Aunt Cassandra had taken over the care of the household. Michelangelo had been lonely and unwanted except by his grandmother, Monna Alessandra, who lived with them and the stonecutter's family across the hill, the stonecutter's wife having suckled him when his own mother had been too ill to nourish her son. For 4 years, until the father had remarried, and Lucretia had insisted that they move into Florence, he had fled at every opportunity to the Topolinos. He would make his way down the wheat fields among the silver-green olives, cross the brook which marked the division of the land, and climb the opposite hill through the vineyards to their yard. Here he would silently set to work cutting the pietra serena from the neighboring quarry into beveled building stones for a new Florentine palace, working out his unhappiness in the precision blows in which he had been trained in the stone-cutter's yard since he was a child, and along with the stone-cutter's own sons, and had been given a small hammer and chisel to work scraps. Michelangelo pulled himself back from the stone-cutter's yard in Settignano to this stone house on the Via del Anguillara. Father, I have just come from Domenico Ghirlandaio's studio. Ghirlandaio has agreed to sign me as an apprentice. IV. During the silence that pulsed between them, Michelangelo heard one of the horses neigh across the street, and Lucrezia stir the embers of her fire in the kitchen. Ludovico used both hands to raise himself to a commanding position over the boy. This inexplicable desire of his son's to become an artisan could be the final push that would topple the shaky Buonarroti into the social abyss. Michelangelo, I apologize for being obliged to apprentice you to the Wool Guild and force you to become a merchant rather than a gentleman. But I sent you to an expensive school, paid out money I could ill afford, so that you would be educated and rise in the guild until you had your own mills and shops. That was how most of the great Florentine fortunes were started, even the Medicis. Ludovico's voice rose. Do you think that I will now allow you to waste your life as a painter? To bring disgrace to the family name? For 300 years no Buonarroti has fallen so low as to work with his hands. That is true. We have been usurers, angrily responded the boy. We belong to the Money Changers' Guild, one of the most respectable in Florence. Money lending is an honorable profession. Michelangelo sought refuge in humor. Have you ever watched Uncle Francesco fold up his counter outside? Or Sir Michael, when it starts to rain? You never saw anyone work faster with his hands. At the mention of his name, Uncle Francesco came running into the room. He was a larger man than Ludovico, with a brighter countenance, the working half of the Buonarroti partnership. 2 years before he had broken away from Ludovico, made considerable money, bought houses, and set himself up in style, only to be lured into a bad investment in foreign currencies, lose everything, and have to move back into his brother's house. Now, when it rained, he scooped up his velvet covering from the folding table, grabbed his bag of coins from between his feet, and ran through the wet streets to his friend, Ammatore, the clothes cutter, who allowed him to set up his table under cover. Francesco said in a hoarse voice, Michelangelo, you couldn't see a crow crow in a bowl full of milk. What perverse pleasure can you derive from injuring the Buonarotti?" The boy was furious at the accusation. "I have as much pride in our name as anyone. Why can't I learn to do fine work that all Florence will be proud of, as they are the Ghiberti's doors, and Donatello's sculptures, and Ghirlandaio's frescoes? Florence is a good city for an artist." Ludovico put his hand on the boy's shoulder, calling him Michael Agnolo, his pet name. This was his favorite of the 5 sons, for whom he had the highest hopes. It was this affection that had given him courage to spend money for 3 years of schooling at Urbino's. The master had been too proud to report to the father that his seemingly bright son had preferred drawing in his notebooks to learning his letters from the collection of Greek and Latin manuscripts. As for rhetoric, the boy had been bound by his own rules of logic, which the persuasive Urbino had been unable to alter. "Michelangelo, the things you say about artists are as true as the word of a bench talker. I've been too angry at your stupidity to do anything but beat you. But you're 13 now. I've paid for your training in logic, so I should practice logic with you. Ghiberti and Donatello began as artisans and ended as artisans. So will Ghirlandaio. Their work never raised their social position 1 braccio, an arm's length, and Donatello was so destitute at the end of his life that Cosimo de' Medici had to give him a charity pension." The boy flared at this attack. "That's because Donatello put all his money into a wire basket hung from the ceiling so his assistants and friends could help themselves when they needed. Ghirlandaio makes a fortune." "Art is like washing an ass's head with lye," observed Francesco. "For the Tuscan wisdom is a web of proverbs. You lose both the effort and the lie. Every man thinks that rubble will turn into gold in his hand. What kind of dreaming is that?" "The only kind I know," cried Michelangelo. He turned back to Ludovico. "Bleed me of art, and there won't be enough liquid left in me to spit." "I prophesied that my Michelangelo would recoup the Buonarotti fortune," cried Ludovico. "I should have spoken with a smaller mouth. Now I'll teach you to be vulgar." He started raining blows on the boy, his right elbow crooked stiffly, so that he could use his arm as a club. Francesco, not wanting to fail his nephew in this critical moment of his youth, also began hitting the boy, boxing his ear with the heel of his palm. Michelangelo lowered his head as dumb beasts do in a storm. There was no point in running away, for then the argument would have to be resumed later. Deep in his throat he sounded the words of his grandmother. "Pazienza!" Patience. No man is born into the world whose work is not born with him. From the corner of his eye he saw his Aunt Cassandra bulking in the doorway, a big-boned woman who seemed to put on flesh from the air she breathed. Cassandra, of the enormous thighs, buttocks, and bosom, with a voice that matched her weight, was an unhappy woman, nor did she feel it her duty to dispense happiness. "Happiness," said Aunt Cassandra, "is for the next world." The boom of Aunt Cassandra's voice, demanding to know what was going on now, hurt his ear more than her husband's palm. Then suddenly all the words and blows stopped, and he knew that his grandmother had entered the room. She was a retiring woman in black, not beautiful, but with a finely modeled head, who exercised her matriarchy only in moments of family crisis. Ludovico did not like to give his mother offense. He slumped into his chair. "That's the end of the discussion," he announced. "I have brought you up not to crave the whole world. It is enough to make money and serve the Buonarotti name. Never let me hear again about this being apprenticed to artists." Michelangelo was glad that his stepmother was too deeply involved in her torta to permit her to leave the kitchen. The room was too crowded now for more spectators. Monna Alessandra went to her son's side at the account desk. What difference does it make whether he joins the wool guild and twists wool, or the apothecaries guild and mixes paints? You won't leave enough money to set up 5 geese, let alone sons. Her voice was without reproach. Had it not been her husband, Leonardo Buonarroti, whose bad judgment and bad luck began the downfall of the family? All 5 boys must look to their living. Let Leonardo go into the monastery as he wishes, and Michelangelo into a studio. Since we can no longer help them, why hinder them? I am going to be apprenticed to Ghirlandaio, father. You must sign the papers. All do well by us all. Ludovico stared at his son in disbelief. Was he possessed by an evil spirit? Should he take him to Arezzo and have him exorcised? Michelangelo, you are saying things that make me swell up a dozen times in anger. He shot his last and crushing bolt. We have not a scudo to pay for any apprenticeship to Ghirlandaio. This was the moment for which Michelangelo had been waiting. He said gently, "There is no need for money, Padre. Ghirlandaio has agreed to pay you for my apprenticeship." "He will pay." Ludovico lunged forward. "Why should he pay me for the privilege of teaching you?" "Because he thinks I have a strong fist." After a considerable silence, Ludovico lowered himself slowly into the leather chair. "Except God keep us, we shall be destroyed. Truthfully, I don't know where you come from. Certainly not from the Buonarroti. All this must be your mother's side, the Rosselli." He spat out the name as though it were a mouthful of wormy apple. It was the first time Michelangelo could remember hearing the name spoken in the Buonarroti house. Ludovico crossed himself, more in perplexity than piety. "Truly, I have conquered myself in more battles than a saint." "5. Domenico Ghirlandaio's was the most bustling and successful Bogota in all Italy. In addition to the 25 frescoed panels and lunettes for the Tornabuoni choir at Santa Maria Novella, which had to be completed in 2 years remaining of the 5-year contract, he had also signed agreements to paint an Adoration of the Kings for the Hospital of the Innocenti, and to design a mosaic for over a portal of the cathedral. Every few days he made a trip on horseback to a neighboring town which wanted him to paint anything from a small altarpiece to the hall of a ducal palace. Ghirlandaio, who never sought a commission, would refuse none. On Michelangelo's first day in the studio, he told him, "If a peasant woman brings you a basket that she wants ornamented, do it as beautifully as you can, for in its modest way it is as important as a fresco on a palace wall." Michelangelo found the place energetic but good-natured. 28-year-old Sebastiano Menardi, with long black hair cut to imitate Ghirlandaio's, a pale narrow face with a jutting bony nose and protruding teeth, was in charge of the apprentices. He was Ghirlandaio's brother-in-law, though not, insisted Jacopo del Indacchio, imp son of a baker, through any willing of his own. Ghirlandaio married him to his sister in order to keep him working for the family. Jacopo told Michelangelo, "So be on your guard." Like most of Jacopo's deviltries, this one contained a kernel of truth. The Ghirlandaio's were a family of artists, having been trained in the workshop of their father, an expert goldsmith, who had originated a fashionable wreath called the Ghirlanda, which the Florentine women wore in their hair. Domenico's two younger brothers, David and Benedetto, were also painters. Benedetto, a miniaturist, wanted to paint only the minute and precise aspects of a woman's jewels or flowers. David, the youngest, had signed the contract for Santa Maria Novella along with his brother. Domenico Ghirlandaio had moved on from his father's studio to that of Baldovinetti, the master of mosaics, where he had remained until he was 21, leaving reluctantly to open his own studio. Painting is drawing, and the true eternal painting is mosaic, he declared, but since few wanted mosaics any more, he had turned to fresco, becoming the greatest absorber and eclectic in Italy. He had learned everything that the earlier fresco painters from the time of Cimabue had to teach. In addition, he added something peculiarly and brilliantly his own. Ghirlandaio had in truth embraced young Minardi as a brother-in-law after the younger apprentice had helped him paint his masterly frescoes in the church of San Giamagnano, a neighboring town of 76 towers. Minardi, who now took Michelangelo in tow, was amazingly like Ghirlandaio's good-natured, talented, well-trained in the studio of Verrocchio, loving above all things to paint, and agreeing with Ghirlandaio that it was the beauty and charm of a fresco that was important. Painting had to tell a story, either from the Bible, religious history, or Greek mythology, but it was not the painter's function to look behind the meaning of that story, to search for its significance, or judge its validity. The purpose of painting, explained Minardi, is his newest apprentice, is to be decorative, to bring stories to life, pictorially, to make people happy, yes, even with the sad pictures of the saints being martyred. Always remember that, Michelangelo, and you will become a successful painter. If Minardi was the major domo of the apprentices, Michelangelo soon learned that 16-year-old Jacopo with the monkey-like face was the ringleader. He had a gift for appearing to be busy without doing a lick of work. He welcomed the 13-year-old boy to the studio by warning him gravely, "Doing nothing else but hard work is not worthy of a good Christian." Turning to the table of apprentices, he added exultantly, "Here in Florence, we average 9 holidays every month. Add Sundays to that, and it means we only have to work every other day." "I can't see that it makes any critical difference to you, Jacopo," commented Granacci with a rare burn of acid. "You don't work on work days." The 2 weeks flew by until the magic day of his contract signing and first pay dawned. Michelangelo suddenly realized how little he had done to earn the 2 gold florins which would constitute his first advance. So far he had been used as an errand boy to pick up paints at the chemist, to screen sand, to give it a fixed texture, and wash it in the barrel with a running hose. Awakening while it was still dark outside, he climbed over his younger brother, Buonarrota, sprang out of the bed, fumbled in the bed bench for his long stockings and knee-length shirt. At the Bargello, he passed under a body hanging from a hook in a cornice. This must be the man who, failing to die when hanged 2 weeks before, had uttered such vengeful words that the 8 magistrates had decided to hang him all over again. Ghirlandaio was surprised to find the boy on his doorstep so early, and his buon giorno, good morning, was short. He had been working for days on a study of St. John baptizing the neophyte, and was upset because he could not clarify his concept of Jesus. He was further annoyed when interrupted by his brother David with a batch of bills that needed paying. Domenico pushed the accounts aside with a brusque gesture of his left hand, continuing to draw irritatedly with his right. "Why can't you manage this bottega, David, and leave me alone to do my painting?" Michelangelo watched the scene with apprehension. Would they forget what day it was? Granacci saw his friend's expression. He slipped off his bench, went to David, murmured something in his ear. David reached into the leather purse he kept hooked onto his wide belt, crossed the room to Michelangelo, and handed him 2 florins and a contract book. Michelangelo quickly signed his name alongside the first payment, as stipulated in the doctor's and apothecary's agreement, then wrote the date, April 16th, 1488. Joy raced through his veins as he anticipated the moment when he would hand the florins to his father. 2 florins were not the wealth of the Medici, but he hoped they would lighten the murky atmosphere around the Buonarroti house. Then he was aware of an enthusiastic hubbub among the apprentices, and the voice of Jacopo saying, "It's agreed. We draw from memory that gnome figure on the alley wall behind the bottega. The one who draws the most accurate reproduction wins and pays for dinner. Siecca, Baldinelli, Granacci, Bugiardini, Tedesco. Are you ready?" Michelangelo felt a dull pain in the chest. He was being left out. His had been a lonely childhood. He had had no intimate friend until Granacci recognized in his young neighbor a talent for drawing. So often he had been excluded from games. Why? Because he had been small and sickly? Because there was not enough laughter in him? Because he communicated with difficulty? He so desperately wanted to be included in the companionship of this young group. But it did not come easy. At the end of his first week, Granacci had to teach him a lesson in getting along with one's contemporaries. 13-year-old heavy-boned Giuliano Bugiardini, a simple-natured lad who had been friendly to Michelangelo from the moment he entered the studio, had done a practice study of a group of women. Bugiardini could not draw the human figure and had no interest in it. "What's the use?" he demanded. "We never show anything except the hands and face." Seeing the sack-like outlines, Michelangelo had impulsively picked up a stub pen and made a number of quick strokes had put limbs under the heavy dresses of the women and infused them with a sense of movement. Bugiardini blinked his heavy eyelids a few times to see his fingers spring to life. He was free of envy and did not resent the corrections. It was the 13-year-old Siecco, who had been apprenticed to Ghirlandaio at the conventional age of 10, who had taken offense. The sharp-tongued Cieco cried out, "You've been studying from a female nude model." "But there's no such thing in Florence," protested Michelangelo. Tedesco, raw-boned, redhead, fruit of an early invasion of Florence, asked in a voice edged with hostility, "Then how do you know about the movements of the woman's breast and thighs? And you can put real people under their clothes." "I watched the woman picking beans in the fields, or walking along the road with a basket of faggots on their head. What your eye sees, your hand can draw." "Ghirlandaio is not going to like this," crowed Jacopo joyously. That evening, Granacci said confidingly, "Be careful about raising jealousies. Cieco and Tedesco have been apprenticed for a long time. How could they see any justice in your being able to draw better instinctively than they can after years of training? Praise their work. Keep your own to yourself." Now at the apprentices' table, Jacopo was completing the details of the game. Time limit, 10 minutes. The winner to be crowned champion and host. "Why can't I compete, Jacopo?" Michelangelo cried. Jacopo scowled. "You're just a beginner. You couldn't possibly win, and there would be no chance of your paying. It wouldn't be fair to the rest of us." Stung, Michelangelo pleaded, "Let me join in, Jacopo. You'll see, I won't do too badly." "All right," Jacopo agreed reluctantly, "but you can't have a longer time. Everyone ready?" Excitedly, Michelangelo picked up charcoal and paper and began hammering down the outlines of the gnarled figure, half youth, half satyr, which he had seen several times on the rear stone wall. He could summon lines from his memory, the way the students at Urbino's school had so miraculously brought forth verses of Homer's Iliad or Virgil's Aeneid when the master demanded them. "Time limit," cried Jacopo. "Line up your drawings, center of the table." Michelangelo ran to the table, put his sketch in line, quickly scanned the other sheets. He was astonished at how unfamiliar, even incomplete, they appeared. Jacopo stared at him with his mouth wide open. "I can't believe it. Look, everyone. Michelangelo has won." There were cries of congratulations. Cieco and Tedesco smiled at him for the first time since their argument. He glowed with pride. He was the newest apprentice, yet he had won the right to buy everyone dinner. Buy everyone dinner? His stomach sank as though he had swallowed his 2 gold florins. He counted heads. There were 7 of them. They would consume 2 liters of red wine, soup of the country, roast veal, fruit, making a sizable hole in one of the gold pieces that he had waited for so eagerly to turn over to his father. On the way to the osteria, with the others rushing ahead, laughing heartily among themselves, a loose thread began flapping in his mind. He ran the spool of his thoughts backward, fell in step beside Granacci. "I was gulled, wasn't I?" "Yes. Why didn't you warn me?" "It's part of the initiation." "What will I tell my father?" "If you had known, would you have made yourself draw badly?" Michelangelo broke into a sheepish grin. They couldn't lose. Six. There was no formal method of teaching at Ghirlandaio's studio. Its basic philosophy was expressed in a plaque which Ghirlandaio had nailed to the wall alongside his desk. The most perfect guide is nature. Continue without fail to draw something every day. Michelangelo had to learn from whatever task each man had at hand. No secrets were kept from him. Ghirlandaio created the overall design, the composition within each panel, and the harmonious relation of one panel to the many others. He did most of the important portraits, but the 100 others were distributed throughout the studio, sometimes several men working on a single figure, and on a one-day spread of plaster, where there was an excellent angle of visibility from the church. Ghirlandaio did the entire panel himself. Otherwise, major portions were painted by Minardi, Benedetto, Granacci, and Bugiardini. On the lateral lunettes, which were hard to see, he let Cieco and Baldinelli, the other 13-year-old apprentice, practice. Michelangelo moved from table to table, doing odd jobs. No one had time to stop work to teach him. He watched Ghirlandaio complete a portrait of Giovanni Tornabuoni, painted as a separate commission, and then draw it for the cartoon of the Visitation panel. "Oil painting is for women," Ghirlandaio said sarcastically, "but this figure will go well in a fresco." "Never try to invest human beings, Michelangelo. Paint into your panels only those whom you have already drawn from life." David and Benedetto shared with Minardi a long table in the far corner of the studio. Benedetto never worked freehand. It seemed to Michelangelo that he paid more attention to the mathematical squares on the paper before him than to the individual character of the person portrayed. Nevertheless, he was an expert with the instruments for squaring up. He told Michelangelo, "Remember that the face is divided in 3 parts. First the hair and forehead, then the nose, then the chin and mouth. Now, take the proportions of a man. I omit those of a woman because there is not one of them perfectly proportioned. The arm with the hand extends to the middle of the thigh. So, the whole length of a man is 8 faces, and equal to its width, with the arms extended. Always remember that a man has on his left side 1 less rib than a woman." Michelangelo tried drawing to Benedetto's geometric plan, with its plumb line and compass half-circles, but the restriction was a coffin into which he could squeeze only dead bodies. Minardi, however, had an accurate hand and a self-assurance that breathed life into his work. He had painted important parts of both lunettes and all the panels, and was working out a color pattern for the Adoration of the Magi. He showed Michelangelo how to tint flesh in tempera, going twice over the naked parts. This first bed of color, particularly for young people with fresh complexions, must be tempered with the yolk of an egg of a city hen. The red yolks of country hens are only fit to temper flesh colorings of old or dark persons. From Minardi, Michelangelo learned to let the green tint under the flesh colors be just visible, to put highlights over the eyebrows and on the top of the nose with a little pure white to outline the eyelids and flashes with black. From Jacopo, he received not technical instructions, but news of the city. Nothing nefarious was safe from Jacopo. He could pass by virtue all his life and never stumble over it. But his nose smelled out the nether side of human nature as instinctively as a bird smells manure. Jacopo was the town's gossip, gatherer, and crier. He made the daily rounds of the inns, the wine and barber shops, the quarters of the prostitutes, the groups of old men sitting on stone benches before the palazzi, for they were the best purveyors of the town's yarns and scandal. Each morning he walked to the workshop by a circuitous route, which enabled him to tap all of his sources. By the time he reached Ghirlandaio's, he had a shopping basketful of the night's news, who had been cuckolded, who was going to be commissioned for what art project, who was about to be put in stocks with his back against the Signora wall. Ghirlandaio had a manuscript copy of Cennini's treatise on painting. Although Jacopo could not read a word, he sat on the apprentice's table with his legs crossed under him, pretending to spell out the passages he had memorized. As an artist, your manner of living should always be regulated, as if you were studying theology, philosophy, or any other science, that is to say, eating and drinking temperately at least twice a day, sparing and reserving your hand, saving it from fatigue caused by throwing stones or iron bars. There is still another cause, the occurrence of which may render your hand so unsteady that it will tremble and flutter more than leaves shaken by the wind, and this is frequenting too much the company of women. Jacopo threw back his head and laughed froth bubbles at the ceiling, then turned upon the quite astonished Michelangelo, who knew less about women than he did of Ptolemy's astronomy. Now you know, Michelangelo, why I don't paint more. I don't want the Ghirlandaio frescoes to tremble and flutter like leaves in the wind. Amiable, easy-going David had been well trained in enlarging to scale the individual sections and transferring them to the cartoon itself, which was the dimensions of the church panel. This was not creative work, but it took skill. He demonstrated how to divide the small painting into squares and the cartoon into the same number of larger squares, how to copy the content of each small square into the corresponding square of the cartoon, pointing out how mistakes that were almost unnoticeable in the small drawing become obvious when blown up to cartoon size. Bugiardini, whose clumsy body made it appear that he would have trouble whitewashing his father's barn, nevertheless managed to get a spiritual tension into his figures for the Visitation, even though they were not accurate anatomically. He made Michelangelo spend one whole dinner period sitting for a sketch. After 2 hours, Bugiardini said, "Have a look at your portrait. I have already caught the expression of your face." Michelangelo broke into laughter. "Bugiardini, you have painted me with one of my eyes on my temple. Look at it." Bugiardini studied Michelangelo's face, then his sketch. "It seems to me your eye is exactly as I painted it, and so is your face." "Then it must be a defect of nature," responded the boy. Taking an indirect route home, Michelangelo and Granacci entered the Piazza della Signora, where a large crowd was gathered, and climbed the steps of the Loggia della Signora. From here they could see into the ringhiera of the palace, where an ambassador of the Turkish Sultan, garbed in eggshell turban and flowing green robes, was presenting a giraffe to the councilmen of the Signoria. Michelangelo wished he could sketch the scene, but knowing that he could capture only a small part of its complexity, he complained to Granacci that he felt like a chessboard with alternating black and white squares of information and ignorance. The next noon he ate sparingly of Lucrezia's veal roast, and returned to the studio, empty now because the others were taking their riposo afternoon nap. He had decided that he must study the drawing of his master. Under Ghirlandaio's desk, he found a bundle labeled Slaughter of the Innocents, took it to the apprentice's table, and spread out the dozens of sheets for the fresco. It seemed to him, poring over the finished fresco, that Ghirlandaio could not portray motion for the soldiers with their swords upraised, the mothers and children running, creating confusion and the emotional chaos in him. Yet these rough studies had simplicity and authority. He began copying the drawings, and had made a half-dozen sketches in quick succession, when he felt someone standing behind him. He turned to find a disapproving frown on Ghirlandaio's face. "Why are you prying into that bundle? Who gave you permission?" Michelangelo put down his charcoal, frightened. "I didn't think there was any secret about it. I want to learn." He regained his composure. "The quicker I learn, the quicker I can help. I want to earn those gold florins." The appeal to his logic served less to banish Ghirlandaio's anger than the intensity in the boy's eyes. "Very well. I'll take some time with you now." "Then teach me how to use a pen." Ghirlandaio took his newest apprentice to his desk, cleared it, and set up 2 corresponding sheets of paper. He handed Michelangelo a blunt-nibbed pen, picked up another for himself, started cross-hatching. "Here's my calligraphy. Circles for the eyes, angular tips for the nose. Like this. Use the short nib to render a mouth, and score the underlip." Michelangelo followed the older man with quick movements of the hand, noting how Ghirlandaio, in sketching a figure, never bothered to finish the legs, but tapered them down to nothing. Ghirlandaio could hang a convincing drapery on a figure with a few rapid strokes, do a woman holding up her dress with delicate grace, achieve a lyrical flow of the body lines, and at the same time give the figures individuality and character. A look of rapture came over Michelangelo's face. This was the happiest he had been. With a pen in hand, he was an artist, thinking out loud, probing his mind, searching his heart for what he felt and his hand for what it could discern about the object before him. He wanted to spend hours at this work desk, redrawing models from 100 different angles. Ghirlandaio was aware of the eagerness in the boy's face, the excitement in his hand. "Michelangelo, you must not draw for its own sake. This figure is not usable in a fresco." Seeing how well his apprentice followed him, Ghirlandaio took from his desk 2 more of his drawings, an almost life-size study of the head of a smooth-cheeked, full-faced, wide-eyed and thoughtful man under 30, with robust modeling, the drawing of the hair finely decorative. The second, the baptism of a man within the choir of a Roman basilica, done with a beauty of composition. "Magnificent!" breathed Michelangelo, reaching for the sheets. "You've learned everything that Masaccio has to teach." The blood drained from Ghirlandaio's dark face. Had he been insulted, judged a copier? But the boy's voice was full of pride. Ghirlandaio was amused. The rawest apprentice was commenting the master. He took the drawings from him. "Sketches are nothing. Only the finished fresco counts. I shall destroy these." They heard the voices of Cecco and Baldinelli outside the studio. Ghirlandaio got up from the desk. Michelangelo picked up his paper and new pen, quickly reassured the bundle of the slaughter of the innocents, had it tied and back in its corner by the time the boys came into the room. Locked in the big drawer of his desk, Ghirlandaio kept a folio from which he studied and sketched while he was conceiving a new panel. Granacci told Michelangelo that it had taken Ghirlandaio years to assemble these drawings of men he considered masters. Taddeo Gaddi, Lorenzo Monaco, Fra Angelico, Paolo Uccello, Pole Uello, Fra Filippo Lippi, and many others Michelangelo had spent enthralled hours gazing at their altars and frescoes, with which the city was lavishly endowed. But he had never seen any of the working studies. "Certainly not," replied Ghirlandaio, brusquely, when Michelangelo asked him if he might see the portfolio. "But why not?" cried Michelangelo desperately. Here was a golden opportunity to study the thinking and techniques of Florence's finest draftsmen. "Every artist assembles his own portfolio," said Ghirlandaio, "according to his own tastes and judgment. I have made my collection over a period of 25 years. You build your own." A few days later, Ghirlandaio was studying a sketch by Benozzo Gozzoli of a nude youth with a spear, when a committee of 3 men called for him to accompany them to a neighboring town. He failed to put the drawing back into the locked drawer. Waiting until the others had left for dinner, Michelangelo went to the desk, took up the Benozzo Gozzoli sketch. After a dozen attempts, he made what he considered a faithful copy, and an errant idea popped into his mind. Could he fool Ghirlandaio with it? The sketch was 30 years old, the paper soiled and yellowing with age. He took some scraps into the backyard, ran his finger over the earth, experimented with rubbing the dirt along the grain of the paper. After a while, he brought his copy out to the yard and slowly began discoloring his own sheet. Old drawing paper had a smoky quality around the edges. He returned to the studio, where a fire burned in the hearth, held his discolored scraps over the smoke for testing, and, after a moment, his copy of the youth. Then he put the imitation on Ghirlandaio's desk and secreted the original. During the weeks, he watched Ghirlandaio's every move, whenever the teacher failed to return a sketch to the portfolio, a Castagno, Signorelli, or Verrocchio. The boy remained behind to make a reproduction. If it was late afternoon, he would take the sheet home and, when the rest of his family was asleep, make a fire in the downstairs hearth and stain the paper the proper color. At the end of the month, he had assembled a portfolio of a dozen fine sketches. At this rate, his folio of master sketches would become as thick as Ghirlandaio's. Ghirlandaio still came in early from the dinner occasionally to give his apprentice an hour of instruction in the use of black chalk, how to work in silver point, and then to intensify the effect with white chalk. Michelangelo asked if they might sometimes draw from nude models. "Why should you want to learn to draw the nude when we must always paint it under drapes?" demanded Ghirlandaio. "There aren't enough nudes in the Bible to make it profitable." "There are the saints," replied the boy. "They have to be nude, nearly, when they are being shot with arrows or burned on a grill." "True. But who wants anatomy in saints? It gets in the way of spirit." "Couldn't it help portray character?" "No. All the character that's necessary to show can be done through the face, and perhaps the hands. No one has worked in nudes since the pagan Greeks. We have to paint for Christians, Besides, our bodies are ugly, misproportioned, full of boils, fever, and excrement. A garden of palms and cypresses, oranges in bloom, an architectural design of a straight stone wall with steps running down to the sea. That is beauty, and non-controversial. Painting should be charming, refreshing, lovely. Who can say that the human body is any of these things? I like to draw figures walking delicately under their gowns, and I would like to draw them the way God made Adam. Seven. With June, the summer heat clamped down on Florence. The boy packed away his calzone, long hose, and stuck his bare feet into sandals. He wore a light cotton shirt. The back doors of the studio were thrown open and the tables moved into the yard, under the green-leafed trees. For the festival of San Giovanni, the bottega was locked tight. Michelangelo rose early, and with his brothers walked down to the Arno, the river which flowed through the city, to swim and play in the mud-brown waters before he met his fellow apprentices at the rear of the Duomo. The piazza was covered by a broad blue awning sewn with golden lilies to represent heaven. Each guild had built its own cloud, high up in which sat its patron saint on a wooden frame, thickly covered by wool, surrounded by lights and cherubs, and sprinkled with tinsel stars. On lower iron branches were children dressed as angels, strapped on by waistbands. At the head of the procession came the cross of Santa Maria del Fiore, and behind it singing companies of wool shearers, shoemakers, bands of boys dressed in white, then giants on stilts, 6 cubits high, hooded with fantastic masks, then 22 towers, mounted on carts, and carrying actors who gave tableaux out of Scripture. The Tower of St. Michael, depicting the battle of the angels, showed Lucifer being cast out of heaven. The Tower of Adam presented God creating Adam and Eve, with the serpent making its entrance. The Tower of Moses acted out the delivery of the law. To Michelangelo, the tableau seemed endless. He had never liked biblical plays and wanted to leave. Granacci, enchanted with the painted scenery, insisted on staying to the very end. Just as High Mass was beginning in the Duomo, a Bolognese was caught stealing purses and gold belt buckles from the worshippers jammed before the pulpit. The crowd in the church and piazza turned into an angry mob shouting, "Hang him! Hang him!" carrying the apprentices along with them to the quarters of the captain of the guard, where the thief was promptly hanged from a window. Later that day, a tremendous wind and hailstorm struck the city, destroying the colorful tents, turning the race course for the Palio into a marsh. Bugiardini, Cieco, Baldinelli, Michelangelo huddled inside the baptistry doors. This storm came because the wretched Bolognese stole in the Duomo on a holiday, cried Cieco. No, no, it's the other way round, protested Bogiardini. God sent the storm as punishment for our hanging a man on a religious holiday. They turned to Michelangelo, who was studying the pure gold sculptures of Ghiberti's second set of doors. Their 10 glorious panels, populated layer upon layer by all the peoples, animals, cities, mountains, palaces of the Old Testament. What do I think? What do I think? Michelangelo said. I think these doors are the gates to paradise. At Ghirlandaio's, the birth of St. John was ready to be transferred to the wall at Santa Maria Novella. Early as he arrived at the studio, Michelangelo found himself to be the last. His eyes opened wide at the excitement, with everyone bustling about, collecting cartoons, bundles of sketches, brushes, pots, and bottles of color, buckets, sacks of sand and lime, pointing sticks. The materials were loaded on a small cart behind an even smaller donkey, and off went the entire studio with Ghirlandaio at its head like a commanding general, and Michelangelo as the newest apprentice driving the cart through the Via del Sole to the sign of the sun, which meant they were entering the Santa Maria Novella parish. He guided the donkey to the right and found himself in the Piazza Santa Maria Novella, one of the oldest and most beautiful in the city. He pulled the donkey up short. In front of him loomed the church, which had stood uncompleted in its rustic brick from 1348 until Giovanni Rassalai, whom Michelangelo counted as an uncle, had had the good judgment to choose Leon Battista Alberti to design the facade of magnificent black and white marble. Michelangelo felt a quickening at the thought of the Rassalai family, the more so because he was not permitted to mention the name of the Buonarroti house, though he had never been inside their palace on the Via della Vigna Nuova. When passing by, he always slowed his pace a little, to see into the spacious gardens with their antique Greek and Roman sculptures, and to study the architecture of Alberti, who had designed the stately building. Gangling Tedesco was the unloading foreman, gustily bossing the 13-year-olds in his moment of command. Michelangelo entered the bronze doors, a roll of sketches in his arms, and stood breathing the cool incense-heavy air. The church stretched before him in the form of an Egyptian cross over 300 feet long, its three-pointed ogive arches and rows of majestic pillars gradually decreasing in distance from each other as they approached the main altar, behind which the Ghirlandaio studio had been working for 3 years. Its lateral walls were covered with bright murals. Immediately over Michelangelo's head stood Giotto's wooden crucifix. He walked slowly up the main aisle, savoring every step, for it was like a journey through Italian art. Giotto, painter, sculptor-architect, who legend said had been discovered by Cimabue as a shepherd boy drawing on a rock, and brought into his studio to become the liberator of painting from its dark Byzantine lifelessness. Giotto was followed by 90 years of imitators until, and here on the left of the church, Michelangelo saw the living, glowing evidence of his Trinity. Masaccio, arising from God alone, knew where, began to paint, and Florentine art was reborn. Across the nave to the left he saw a Brunelleschi crucifix, the Strozzi family chapel, with frescoes and sculptures by the Orcagna brothers. The front of the major altar with its Ghiberti bronzes, and then, as the epitome of this magnificence, the Rucellai chapel, built by his own mother's family in the middle of the 13th century, when they had come into their fortune through a member of the family who had discovered in the Orient how to produce a beautiful red dye. Michelangelo had never been able to get himself to mount the few stairs leading to the Rucellai chapel, even though it contained the supreme art treasures of Santa Maria Novella. The grudging family loyalty had kept him out. Now that he had made his break from the family and was going to work here in Santa Maria Novella, had he not earned the right to enter? Enter without feeling an intruder on that side of the family, which after his mother's death had cut all communication, caring nothing of what happened to the 5 sons of Francesca Rucellai del Sierra, daughter of Maria Bonda Rucellai. He put down the package he was carrying and walked up the stairs slowly. Once inside the chapel, with its Cimabue, Madonna, and marble Virgin and Child by Nino Pisano, he fell to his knees, for this was the very chapel where his mother's mother had worshipped all through her youth, and where his mother had worshipped on those feast days of family reunion. Tears burned, then overflooded his eyes. He had been taught prayers, but he had only mouthed the words. Now they sprang to his lips unbidden. Was he praying to the beautiful Madonnas or to his mother? Was there truly a difference? Had she not been very like the Madonnas above him? Whatever vague memories he had of her melted into those of the lady. He rose, walked to the Pisano Virgin, and ran his long bony fingers sentiently over the marble drapery. Then he turned and left the chapel. For a moment he stood on top of the stairs, thinking of the contrast between his 2 families. The Rucellai had built this chapel around 1265, at the same time that the Buonarroti had come into their wealth. The Rucellai had recognized the finest practitioners, almost the creators of their arts. Cimabue in painting. Somewhere around the close of the 13th century, and Nino Pisano in 1365. Even now, in 1488, they were in friendly competition with the Medici for the marble sculptures being dug up in Greece, Sicily, and Rome. The Buonarroti had never commissioned a chapel. Every family of similar wealth had done so. Why not they? Behind the choir, he could see his comrades loading supplies up on the scaffolding. Was it enough to say that it had happened because the Buonarroti were not and never had been religious? Ludovico's conversation was interlarded with religious expressions. But Monna Alessandra had said of her son, "Ludovico approves all the Church's laws, even when he doesn't obey them." The Buonarroti had always been hard men with the Florin, sharing the native shrewdness about money and the fierce concentration in guarding it, had the willingness to invest solely in houses and land, the only true source of wealth to a Tuscan, kept the Buonarroti from ever wasting a scudo on art. Michelangelo could not remember having seen a painting or sculpture of the simplest nature in a Buonarroti house. This took considerable doing for a family of wealth living for 300 years in the most creative city in the world, where even homes of modest means had religious works that had come down through the generations. He turned back for a last look at the frescoed walls of the Rosselli chapel, realizing with a sinking heart that the Buonarroti were not only stingy, they were enemies of art because they despised the men who created it. A shout from Bugiardini on the scaffolding called him. He found the entire studio moving in harmony. Bugiardini had put a heavy coat of intonaco on the panel the day before, hatching a rough surface on which he was now plastering the precise area to be painted that day. With Cieco, Baldinelli, and Tedesco, he took up the cartoon, which they held over the wet panel. Ghirlandaio pounced the lines of the figures onto the fresh intonaco with a pointed ivory stick, then gave the signal for it to be taken away. The young apprentices scrambled down the scaffolding, but Michelangelo remained to watch Ghirlandaio mix his mineral earth colors in little jars of water, squeeze his brush between his fingers, and commence his painting. He had to work surely and swiftly, for his task had to be completed before the plaster dried that night. If he delayed, the unpainted plaster formed a crust from the air currents blowing through the church, and these portions would stain and grow moldy. If he had failed to gauge accurately how much he could do that day, the remaining dry plaster would have to be cut away the following morning, leaving a discernible seam. Retouching was forbidden. Colors, added later, needed to contain size, which would discolor the fresco, turning it black. Michelangelo stood on the scaffolding with a bucket of water, sprinkling the area just ahead of Ghirlandaio's flying brush to keep it moist. He understood for the first time the truth of the saying that no coward ever attempted fresco. He watched Ghirlandaio moving boldly forward, painting the girl with the basket of ripe fruits on her head, the billowing gown, then, in fashion which made the Florentine girls look like carrying matrons, next to him stood Menardi, painting the two older, sedate aunts of the Tornabuoni family, come to visit Elizabeth. Benedetto was highest on the scaffold, painting the elaborate cross-beam ceiling. Granacci had been assigned the serving girl in the center of the background, bringing in a tray to Elizabeth. David was working on Elizabeth reclining against the richly carved wooden bedboard. Bugiardini, who had been allotted the window and door frames, summoned Michelangelo to his side. flicking his fingers for him to sprinkle some water, then stepped back in admiration from the tiny window he had just painted above Elizabeth's head. "Have you ever seen a more beautiful window?" he demanded. "Brilliant," Bugiardini replied Michelangelo, "particularly the open space that we see through." Bugiardini studied his work, puzzled but proud. "You like that part too? Funny, I haven't painted it yet." The climax of the panel was reached when Ghirlandaio, with Menardi assisting, painted the exquisite young Giovanni Tornabuoni, elaborately robed with the richest of Florentine silks and jewels, gazing straight out at Ghirlandaio, not in the least interested in either Elizabeth sitting up in her high-backed bed, or John suckling at the breast of another Tornabuoni beauty sitting on the bed-bench. The panel took 5 days of concentrated work. Michelangelo alone was not permitted to apply paint. He was torn. Part of him felt that though he had been in the studio for only 3 months, he was as qualified to work the wall as the other 13-year-olds. At the same time, an inner voice kept telling him that all of this feverish activity had nothing to do with him. Even when he felt most unhappy about being excluded, he wanted to run out of the choir and the studio to the world of his own. Toward the end of the week, the plaster began to dry. The burnt lime recovered its carbonic acid from the air, mixing the colors. Michelangelo saw that his belief that the pigments sat into the wet plaster was a mistake. They remained on the surface, covered by a crystalline coat of carbonate of lime, which fitted them the way the skin of a young athlete contains his flesh and blood. The entire panel now had a metallic luster, which would protect the colors from heat, cold, and moisture. But the amazing fact was that each day's segment was drying slowly to the very colors Ghirlandaio had created in his studio. And yet, when he went alone to Santa Maria Novella the following Sunday during Mass, weaving his way through the worshipping Florentines in their short velvet farcette doublets, voluminous cloaks of camlet trimmed in miniver, and high-crowned hats, he felt let down. So much of the freshness and vigor had leaked out from the drawings. The 8 women were still lifes in mosaic, as if made of hard bits of colored stone. And certainly it was not the birth of John to the modest family of Elizabeth and Zacharias. It was a social gathering in the home of a merchant prince of Italy, utterly devoid of religious spirit or content. Standing before the brilliant panel, the boy realized that Ghirlandaio loved Florence. The city was his religion. He was spending his life painting its people, its palaces, its exquisitely decorated rooms, its architecture and streets thronging with life, its religious and political pageants. And what an eye he had! Nothing escaped him. Since no one would commission him to paint Florence, he had made Florence Jerusalem. The desert of Palestine was Tuscany, and all the biblical people modern Florentines, because Florence was more pagan than Christian. Everyone was pleased with Ghirlandaio's sophisticated portraits. Michelangelo walked out of the church feeling depressed. The forms were superb, but where was the substance? His eyes hazed over as he tried to formulate words to shape the thoughts pushing against each other inside his head. He too wanted to learn how to set down accurately what he saw, but what he felt about what he saw would always be more important. Eight. He drifted over to the Duomo, where young men gathered on the cool marble steps to make laughter and view the passing pageant. Every day in Florence was a fair. On Sundays, this richest city in Italy, which had supplanted Venice in its trade with the Orient, was out to prove that its 33 banking palaces were providing wealth for all. The Florentine girls were blonde, slender. They carried their heads high, wore colorful coverings on their hair, and long-sleeved gowns, high-necked with overlapping skirts, pleated and full, their breasts outlined in filmier fabric and color. The older men were in somber cloaks, but the young men of the prominent families created the great splash between the Duomo steps and the baptistry by wearing their calzoni, and each leg dyed differently and patterned accordingly to the family blazon. Their suite of attendants followed in identical dress. Jacopo was sitting on top of an old Roman sarcophagus, one of several that stood against the jagged tan brick face of the cathedral. From here he kept up a running comment about the passing girls, while his scandalous eye sought out the ones to whom he awarded the highest accolade. Ah, how mattressable! Michelangelo went to Jacopo's side, ran his hand caressingly over the sarcophagus, his fingers tracing out in its low relief the funeral procession of fighting men and horses. Fell, how these marble figures are still alive and breathing. His voice carried such exultation that his friends turned to stare at him. Now his secret had burst into the open of the Florentine dusk, with the sinking sun setting the domes of the baptistery and cathedral on fire. His hunger had gotten the better of him. God was the first sculptor. He made the first figure, man. And when he wanted to give his laws, what material did he use? Stone. The 10 Commandments engraved on a stone tablet for Moses. What were the first tools that men carved for themselves? Stone. Look at all us painters lolling on the Duomo steps. How many sculptors are there? His fellow apprentices were stunned by the outburst. Even Jacopo stopped searching for girls. They had never heard him speak with such urgency, his eyes glowing like amber coals in the fading light. He told them why he thought there were no more sculptors. The strength expended in carving with hammer and chisel exhausted mind and body alike, in contrast to the brushes, pens, and charcoal which the painter used so lightly. Jacopo hooted. Granacci answered his young friend. If extreme fatigue is the criterion of art, then the quarryman, taking the marble out of the mountain with his wedges and heavy levers, has to be considered nobler than the sculptor. The blacksmith, greater than the goldsmith, and the mason more important than the architect. Michelangelo flushed. He had made a bad start. He studied the grinning faces of Jacopo, Tedesco, and the two 13-year-olds. But you have to agree that the work of the art becomes noble in the degree to which it represents the truth. Then sculpture will come closer to true form, for when you work the marble, the figure emerges on all four sides. His words, usually so sparse, spilled over each other. The painter laid his paint on a flat surface, and by use of perspective tried to persuade people that they were seeing the whole of a scene. But just try to walk around a person in a painting, or around a tree. It was an illusion, a magician's trick. Now the sculptor, he carved the full reality. That was why sculpture bore the same relationship to painting that truth did to falsehood. And if a painter blundered, what did he do? He patched and repaired and covered over with another layer of paint. The sculptor, on the contrary, had to see within the marble the form that it held. He could not glue back broken parts. That was why there were no more sculptors today, because it took 1,000 times more accuracy of judgment and vision. He stopped abruptly, breathing hard. Jacopo jumped down from his perch on the lid of the sarcophagus, extended his two arms to indicate that he had taken over. He was bright. He liked painting and understood it, even though he was too lazy to work at it. Sculpture is a bore. What can they make? A man, a woman, a lion, a horse, then all over again. Monotonous. But the painter can portray the whole universe, the sky, the sun, the moon and the stars, clouds and rain, mountains, trees, rivers, seas. The sculptors have all perished of boredom. Sebastiano Menardi joined the group and stood listening. He had taken his wife for her weekly walk, then returned to the Duomo steps and the company of his young men friends, which, like all Florentines, he enjoyed more than that of women. There were spots of color on his usually pale cheeks. That's true. The sculptor needs only a strong arm and an empty mind. Yes, empty. After a sculptor draws his simple design, what goes on inside his head during the hundreds of hours that he has to pound these chisels and points with a hammer? Nothing. But the painter has to think of 1,000 things every moment to relate all the integral parts of a painting, creating the illusion of a third dimension in craftsmanship. That's why a painter's life is exciting and a sculptor's dull. Tears of frustration welled in Michelangelo's eyes. He cursed himself for his inability to carve out in words the stone forms that he felt in his innards. Painting is perishable. A fire in the chapel, too much cold and the paint begins to fade, crack. But stone is eternal. Nothing can destroy it. When the Florentines tore down the Colosseum, what did they do with the blocks? Built them into new walls. And think of the Greek sculpture that is being dug up. 2,000-3,000 years old. Show me a painting that's 2,000 years old. Look at this Roman marble sarcophagus, as clear and strong as the day it was carved. And as cold, cried Tedesco. Menardi raised his arm for attention. Michelangelo, he began gently, has it ever occurred to you that the reason there are no sculptors left is because of the cost of material? A sculptor needs a rich man or organization to give him a supply of marble and bronze. The Wool Guild of Florence financed Ghiberti for 40 years to make the doors of the Baptistery. Commisso de' Medici supplied Donatello with the resources he needed. Who would provide you with the stone? Who would support you while you practiced on it? Paint is cheap. Commissions are abundant. That's why we take on apprentices. And as for the danger of working in sculpture and making the fatal mistake, what about the painter working in fresco? If the sculptor must see the form inherent in the stone, must not the painter foresee the final result of his color in the fresh, wet plaster and know precisely how it will turn out when dry? Michelangelo, numbly, had to agree that this was true. Besides, continued Minardi, everything that can ever be accomplished in sculpture has already been created by the Pisanos, by Ghiberti, Orcagna, Donatello. Take Desiderio da Settignano or Mino da Fiesoli. They made pretty charming copies of Donatello and Bartoldo, who helped Donatello cast his figures and was there to learn the secrets that Donatello learned from Ghiberti. What has Bartoldo created except a few miniatures reduced from Donatello's great concepts? And now he's sick and dying, his work done. No, the sculptor can do little more than copy, since the range of sculpture is so narrow. Michelangelo turned away. If only he knew more. Then he could convince them of the magnificence of fashioning figures in space. Granacci touched the boy's shoulder comfortingly. Have you forgotten, Michelangelo, what Praxiteles said? Painting and sculpture have the same parents. They are sister arts. But Michelangelo refused to compromise. Without another word, he walked down the cool marble steps, away from the Duomo, over the cobbled streets to home. (9) The night was sleepless. He rolled and tossed. The room was hot, for Lodovico said that air coming in a window was as bad as a crossbow shot. Buonarrota, who shared the bed, was placid in sleep, as in all other things. Though 2 years younger than Michelangelo, he was the manager of the 5 boys. In the bed closer to the door, with the curtains drawn around it, slept the good and evil of the Buonarroti progeny. Leonardo, 1 year and a half older than Michelangelo, who spent his days yearning to be a saint, and Giovansimone, 4 years younger. Lazy, rude to his parents, who had once set fire to Lucrezia's kitchen because she had disciplined him. Sigismondo, the youngest, still slept in a trundle at the foot of Michelangelo's bed. Michelangelo suspected that the boy would never be anything but a simpleton, since he lacked all capacity to learn. Quietly he sprang out of his bed, slipped into his loincloth braccia, short drawers, shirt and sandals, and left the house. He walked down the Via del Anglera, the streets freshly washed, and the stoops scrubbed, to Piazza Santa Croce, where the Franciscan church stood roughly and dark in its unfinished brick, As he passed the open-sided gallery, his eyes sought the outline of the Nino Pisano sarcophagus, held up by its four carved allegorical figures. He turned left on the Via del Fosso, built at the second limit of the city walls, past the prison, then the house belonging to the nephew of St. Catherine of Siena, and at the end of the street, at the corner of the Swallows, the city's famous chemist shop. From here he turned into Via Pietropiana, street of the flat stones, which led through Piazza Sant'Ambrogio, in the church of which were buried the sculptors Verrocchio and Mino da Fiesole. From the piazza he followed the Borgo La Croce until it led to a country road called Via Pontassieve, at the end of which he came to the Africo River, an affluent of the Arno, its green banks covered with trees and luxuriant vegetation. After crossing the Via Piagentina, he reached Varlungo, a little cluster of houses at what had been a Roman ford, then turned once again to the left and made his way up the slope towards Settignano. He had been walking for an hour. Dawn flashed hot and bright. He paused on the hillside to watch the mammal hills of Tuscany emerge from their dark sleep. He cared little about the beauties of nature, and so moved painters. The red poppies in the growing green wheat, the stands of almost black cypresses. No. He loved the valley of the Arno because it was a sculptured landscape. God was the supreme carver. The lyrical hills, each range composed by a draftsman's hand, complementing the succeeding ranges as they rolled back with nothing the eye could see that was carelessly conceived. In the clarity of its air-distant peaks, rolling ridges, villas, trees, those miles away, stood out to be touched, their form tactile. Here nature's perspective worked in reverse. The more distant the object, the nearer at hand it seemed. The Tuscan was a natural sculptor. When he took over the landscape, he built his stone terraces, planted his vineyards and olive orchards in harmony with the hills. No two haycocks were shaped the same. Each family inherited a sculptural form, circular, oblong, umbrella, tent, which stood as the sign for the farm. It climbed the cart road into the hills, closed in by the walls that are the buttress of the Tuscan's life, giving him privacy and security, and at the same time sustaining his land and his sovereignty, standing as much as 13 feet high to hold the descending slopes and build to last 100 generations. Stone was the dominant factor. With it he built his farms and villas, enclosed his fields, terraced his slopes to retain his soil. Nature had been bountiful with stone. Every hill was an undeveloped quarry. If the Tuscan scratched deep with his fingernail, he struck building materials sufficient for a city. And when he built of a dry rock, his walls stood as though masoned. The skills with which men handle stone tells how civilized they are. He left the road where it turned off for the quarry at Maiano. For 4 years after his mother died, he had been left to roam this countryside, though it was the proper age for him to be in school. There was no master at Settignano, and his father had been too withdrawn to care. Now he climbed through land of which he knew every jutting boulder and tree and furrow. His upward push brought him to the settlement of Settignano, a dozen houses collected around a grey stone church. This was the heart of the stonemason country, having bred the greatest scalpellini in the world. The generations that had built Florence. It was only 2 miles from the city, on the first rise above the valley floor, and an easy haul to town. It was said of Settignano that its surrounding hills had a stone heart and velvet breasts. As he walked through the tiny settlement toward the Buonarroti home, he passed a dozen stone yards scattered among the poderi or farms. Shortly he came to the big yard that had produced Desiderio da Settignano. Death had caused him to drop his hammer and chisel at the age of 36, but even by that time he was famous. Michelangelo knew well his marble tombs in Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella, with their exquisite angels and the Virgin carved so tenderly that she appeared asleep rather than dead. Desiderio had taken in Mino da Fiesole, who was just a young hewer of stones, and taught him the art of carving marble. Mino had wandered off to Rome in grief over the loss of his master. Now there was no sculptor left in Florence. Ghiberti, who had trained Donatello, and the Pollaiuolo brothers, had died some 13 years before. Donatello, who had died 22 years ago, had operated a studio for half a century, but of his followers, Antonio Rossellino had been dead 9 years. Luca della Robbia, 6, Verrocchio, had just died. The Pollaiuolo brothers had moved to Rome 4 years ago, and Bertoldo, Donatello's favorite and heir to his vast knowledge and workshop, was fatally ill. Andrea and Giovanni della Robbia, trained by Luca, had abandoned stone sculpture for enameled terracotta reliefs. Yes, sculpture was dead. Unlike his father, who wished he had been born 100 years before, Michelangelo asked only that he could have been born 40 years ago, so that he could have been trained under Ghiberti, or 30 years so he could have been apprenticed to Donatello, or even 20 or 10 or 5 years sooner, so that he could have been taught to work the marble by the Pollaiuolo brothers, by Verrocchio or Luca della Robbia. He had been born too late into a country where for 250 years, since Niccolo Pisano had unearthed some Greek and Roman marbles and begun carving, there had been created in Florence and the valley of the Arno the greatest wealth of sculpture since Phidias completed his work on the Greek Parthenon. a mysterious plague which affected Tuscan sculptors had wiped out the very last of them. The species, after having flourished so gloriously, was now extinct. Sick at heart, he moved on. Ten. Down the winding road a few hundred yards was the Buonarroti villa, in the midst of a 5-acre farm leased to strangers on a long-term agreement. He had not been here for months. As always, he was surprised by the beauty and spaciousness of the house, hewn 200 years before from the best Maiano pietra serena, graceful in its austere lines, and with broad porches overlooking the valley, the river gleaming below like a silversmith's decoration. He could remember his mother moving in the rooms, weaving on the broad downstairs porch, kissing him good night in his big corner room overlooking the Buonarroti fields, the creek at the bottom, and the Topolino family of stonemasons on the opposite ridge. He crossed the backyard and the bone-textured stone walk, past the stone cistern with its intricate hatching and cross-hatching from which he had taken his first drawing lesson. He then scampered down the hill between the wheat on one side and the ripening grapes on the other, to the deep creek at the bottom shaded by lush foliage. He slipped out of his shirt, short drawers and sandals, and rolled over and over in the cool water, enjoying its wetness on his anxious, tired body. Then he crouched in the hot sun for a few moments to dry, put on his clothes, and climbed refreshed to the opposite ridge. He paused when he came in sight of the yard. This was the picture he loved, one which meant home and security for him. The father working with tempered iron chisels to round a fluted column. The youngest son beveling a set of steps, one of the older two carving a delicate window frame, the other graining a door panel, the grandfather polishing a column on a pumice wheelstone with thin river sand. Behind them were 3 arches, and under them scurrying chickens, ducks, pigs. In the boy's mind there was no difference between a scalpolino and a scultore, a stone-cutter and a sculptor, for the scalpolini were fine craftsmen, bringing out the color and grain of pietra serena. There might be a difference in the degree of artistry, but not in kind. Every stone of the Pazzi, Pitti, and Medici palaces was cut, beveled, given a textured surface as if it were a piece of sculpture, which to the Settignano Scalpolino it was. Lesser craftsmen were confined to making a routine blocks for smaller houses and paving stones for the streets. Yet so proud were all Florentines of their simplest paving blocks, that the whole town bragged of the wretch who, being jostled in the cart that was taken him to the Palazzo della Signora for hanging, cried out in protest. What idols were these who cut such clumsy blocks? The father heard Michelangelo's footsteps. Beyond thee, Michelangelo, beyond thee, Topolino. Come va? How goes it? Non sia male, not bad. Ite, and you? Non sia male, the Honorable Lodovico. He goes well. Topolino did not really care how things went with Lodovico. He had forbidden Michelangelo to come here. No one got up, for the stonemason rarely breaks his rhythm. The two older boys, and the one exactly Michelangelo's age, called out with welcoming warmth. Benvenuto, Michelangelo. Welcome. Salve. Good health, Bruno. Salve, Gilberto. Salve, Enrico. The Scalpellino's words are few and simple, matching in length the single blow of the hammer. When he chips at the stone, he does not speak at all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. No word from the lips, only the rhythm of the shoulder and the moving hand with the chisel. Then he speaks in the period of pause. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sentence must fit the rest count of 4, or it remains unsaid or incomplete. If thought must be involved, it will be space between several work counts of 7, filling 2 or 3 counts of 4. But the Scalpellino has learned to confine his thinking to what can be expressed in the single 4-count pause. There was no schooling for the stoneman. Topolino figured his contracts on his fingers. The sons were given a hammer and chisel at 6, as Michelangelo had been, and by 10 they were working full time on the stone. There was no marriage outside the stone ring. Agreements with builders and architects were handed down from generation to generation, as were the quarrying jobs at Meiano, where no outsider could find work. Between the arches hung an oblong piece of pietra serena, with examples of the classic treatments of the stone: herringbone, subia, punch-hole, rustic, crosshatch, linear, bevel, centered, right angle, receding step. The first alphabet Michelangelo had been given, and still the one he used more comfortably than the lettered alphabet with which he had been taught to read the Bible and Dante. Topolino spoke. "Your apprentice to Ghirlandaio?" "Yes." "You do not like it?" "Not greatly." "Peccato." "Too bad." "Who does somebody else's trade?" "Makes soup in a basket," said the old grandfather. "Why do you stay?" It was the middle brother asking. "Where else is there to go?" "We could use a cutter." This was from Bruno. Michelangelo looked from the oldest son to the father. "Davvero." "It is true?" "Davvero." "You will take me as apprentice?" "With stone you're no apprentice. You earn a share." His heart leaped. Everyone chipped in silence, while Michelangelo stood above the father who had just offered him a portion of the food that went into the family's belly. "My father." "Ecco, there you are." "Can I cut?" The grandfather, turning his wheel, replied. "Every little bit helps," said the father, who peed into the Arno, because his son's boat was beached at Pisa. Michelangelo sat before a roughed-out column, a hammer in one hand, a chisel in the other. He liked the heft of them. Stone was concrete, not abstract. One could not argue it from every point of the compass, like love or theology. No theorist had ever separated stone from its quarry bed. He had a natural skill, unrusted after the months of being away. Under his blows the pietra serena cut like cake. There was a natural rhythm between the inward and outward movement of his breath, and the up and down movement of his hammer arm as he slid the chisel across the cutting groove. The tactile contact with the stone made him feel that the world was right again, and the impact of the blows sent waves of strength up his skinny arms, to his shoulders, torso, down through his diaphragm and legs into his feet. The Pietra Serena they were working was warm and alive blue-gray, a reflector of changing lights, refreshing to look at. The stone had durability, yet it was manageable, resilient, as joyous in character as in color, bringing an Italian blue sky serenity to all who worked it. The Topolinos had taught him to work the stone with friendliness, to seek its natural forms, its mountains and valleys, even though it might seem solid, never to grow angry or unsympathetic toward the material. Stone works with you. It reveals itself, but you must strike it right. Stone does not resent the chisel. It is not being violated. Its nature is to change. Each stone has its own character. It must be understood. Handle it carefully, or it will shatter. Never let stone destroy itself. Stone gives itself to skill and to love. His first lesson had been that the power and the durability lay in the stone, not in the arms or tools. The stone was master, not the mason. If ever a mason came to think he was master, the stone would oppose and thwart him. And if a mason beat his stone as an ignorant contadino might beat his beast, the rich, warm, glowing, breathing material became dull, colorless, ugly, died under his hand, to kicks and curses, to hurry and dislike. It closed a hard stone veil around its soft inner nature. It could be smashed by violence, but never forced to fulfill. To sympathy it yielded, grew even more luminous and sparkling, achieved fluid forms and symmetry. From the beginning, he had been taught that stone had a mystic. It had to be covered at night because it would crack if the full moon got on it. Each block had areas inside where it was hollow and bent. In order for it to remain docile, it had to be kept warm in sacks, and the sacks kept damp. Heat gave the stone the same undulations it had in its original mountain home. Ice was its enemy. Stone will speak to you. Listen as you strike with the side of your hammer. Stone was called after the most precious of foods, carne, meat. The Scalpolini respected this stone. To them it was the most enduring material in the world. It had not only built their homes, farms, churches, town, but for 1,000 years had given them a trade, a skill, a pride of workmanship, a living. Stone was not king, but God. They worshipped it as did their pagan Etruscan ancestors. They handled it with reverence. Michelangelo knew them as men of pride, to care for their cattle, pigs, vines, olives, wheat. This was ordinary work. They did it well in order to eat well. But working the stone, that was where a man lived. Had not the setting Anese quarried, shaped, and built the most enchanting city in all Europe? Florence, jewel of the stone carver's art, its beauty created, not by whom there would have been no infinite variety of shape and decoration. Mona, Margarita, a formless woman who worked the animals and fields as well as the stove and tub, had come out of the house and stood under the arch, listening. She was the one about whom Ludovico had said bitterly when Michelangelo wished to work with his hands, "A child sent out to nurse will take on the condition of the woman who feeds him." Had sucked. She had suckled him with her own son for 2 years, and the day her breast ran dry, she put both boys on wine. Water was for bathing before Mass. Michelangelo felt for Mona Margherita much as he did for Mona Alessandra, his grandmother, affection and security. He kissed her on both cheeks. "Buono giorno, figlio mio. Buono giorno, madre mia." "Pazienza," she counseled. Ghirlandaio is a good master, who has an art, has always a part. The father had risen. "I must choose at Cave Maiano. Will you help load?" "Willingly." "Arrivederci, nonno, grandfather. Arrivederci, Bruno. Addio, Gilberto. Addio, Enrico. Addio, Michelangelo." They rode side by side on the high seat behind the 2 beautiful-faced white oxen. In the fields the olive pickers were mounted on ladders made of slender tree stalks, notched to take the light crossbear branches. Baskets were tied around their waist with rope, flat against the stomach and crotch. They held the branches with their left hand, stripping down the little black olives with a milking movement of the right. Pickers are talkers, 2 to a tree. They speak their phrases to each other through the branches, for to the contadino, not to talk is to be dead, a little Topolino said under his breath. "Daws love another prattle." The road, winding along the contour of the range, dipped into a valley, and then slowly climbed Mount Cesare to the quarry. As they rounded the bend of Maiano, Michelangelo saw the gorge in the mountain, with its alternating blue and gray Serena and iron-stained streaks. The Pietra Serena had been buried in horizontal layers. From this quarry, Brunelleschi had chosen the stones for his exquisite churches of San Lorenzo and Santo Spirito. High on the cliff, several men were outlining a block to be quarried with a scribus, a point driven against the grain to loosen the hold from the main mass. He could see the point marks in successive layers through the stone formation. Layers of stone peaked off as though stripped from a pile of parchment sheets. The level work area, where the strata fell after they were loosened, was shimmering with heat and dust from the cutting, splitting, shaping, by men wet with perspiration, small, lean, sinewy men who worked the rock from dawn to dark without fatigue, and who could cut as straight a line with hammer and chisel as a draftsman with a pen and ruler, as concentrated in their hardness, the durability, as the rock itself. He had known these men since he was 6, and began riding behind the white oxen with Topolino. They greeted him, asked how things went, a primordial people, spending their lives with the simplest and most rudimentary force on earth, stone of the mountain, thrown up on the third day of Genesis. Topolino inspected the newly quarried stone with the running commentary Michelangelo knew so well, that one has knots, too much iron in this. Shale, it'll crumble into crystals like sugar on a bun. This one will be hollow, until finally, climbing over the rocks and making his way toward the cliff, he let out his breath sharply. Ah, here is a beautiful piece of meat. There is a way of making stone lift itself by distributing the tension. Michelangelo had been shown how to handle the density of the material without pulling his arms out of their sockets. He planted his legs wide, swung his weight from the hips. Topolino opened the first crack between the stone and the ground with an iron bar. They moved the stone over the boulders to open ground. Then, with the help of the quarrymen, the block was fulcrumed upward through the open tail of the cart. Michelangelo wiped the sweat from his face with his shirt. Rain clouds swept down the Arno from the mountains to the north. He bade Topolino goodbye. "A domani," replied Topolino, flicking the lines for the oxen to move off. Until tomorrow, Michelangelo thought, tomorrow being the next time I take my place with the family, be it a week or a year. He left the quarry, stood on the hill below Fiesole. Warm rain fell on his upturned face. The dark clumps of leaves on the olives were silver green. In the wheat the peasant women were cutting with colored kerchiefs over their hair. Below him, Florence looked as though someone were sprinkling it with gray powdered dust, blotting out the carpet of red tile roofs. Only the mammal dome of the cathedral stood out, and the straight, proud, upward thrust of the tower of the Signoria, complementary symbols under which Florence flourished and multiplied. He made his way down the mountain, feeling 15 feet tall. (11) Having taken a day off without permission, Michelangelo was at the studio early. Ghirlandaio had been there all night, drawing by candlelight. He was unshaven, his blue beard and hollow cheeks in the flickering night giving him the appearance of an anchorite. Michelangelo went to the side of the platform on which the desk stood majestically, in command of its bottega, waiting for Ghirlandaio to look up, then asked, "Is something wrong?" Ghirlandaio rose, raised his hands warily to breast height, then shook his fingers up and down loosely, as though trying to shed his troubles. The boy stepped onto the platform and stood gazing down at the dozens of incomplete sketches of the Christ whom John was to baptize. The figures were slight to the point of delicacy. "I'm intimidated because of the subject," Ghirlandaio growled to himself. "I've been afraid to use a recognizable Florentine." He picked up a pen and flicked it swiftly over a sheet. What emerged was an irresolute figure, dwarfed by the bold John whom Ghirlandaio had already completed, and who was waiting, bowl of water in hand. He flung down the pen in disgust, muttered that he was going home for some sleep. Michelangelo went into the cool backyard and began sketching in the clear light that broke open Florence's summer days. For a week he drew experimentally. Then he took a fresh paper and set down a figure with powerful shoulders, muscularity, developed chest, broad hips, a full oval stomach, and a robust pair of thighs rooted firmly in big solid feet. A man who could split a block of Pietra Serena with one blow of the hammer. Ghirlandaio was shocked when Michelangelo showed him his Christ. "You used a model?" "The stonemason in Settignano, who helped raise me." "Christ a stonemason?" "He was a carpenter." "Florence won't accept the working-class Christ, Michelangelo. They're used to having him genteel." Michelangelo suppressed a tiny smile. "When I was first apprenticed, you said the true eternal painting is mosaic, and sent me up to San Miniato to see the Christ Baldovinetti restored from the 10th century. That Christ is no wool merchant from Prato." "It's a matter of crudity, not strength," replied Ghirlandaio. "Easy for the young to confuse. I will tell you a story. When Donatello was very young, he once spent a lot of time making a wooden crucifix for Santa Croce, and when it was finished, he took it to his friend Brunelleschi. "It seemed to me," said Brunelleschi, "that you have put a plowman on the cross rather than the body of Jesus Christ, which was most delicate in all its parts." Donatello, upset at the unexpected criticism from the older man, cried, "If it were as easy to make this figure as to judge it, try to make one yourself." That very day Brunelleschi set to work. Then he invited Donatello to dinner. But first the two friends bought some eggs and fresh cheese. When Donatello saw the crucifix in Brunelleschi's hall, he was so amazed that he threw up his arms in resignation, the eggs and the cheese that he had been holding in his apron falling to the floor. Brunelleschi said laughingly, "What are we to have for dinner, Donato, now that you have broken the eggs?" Donatello, who could not take his eyes off the beautiful Christ, answered, "It is your work to make Christs, and mine to make plowmen." Michelangelo knew both crucifixes, the one of Brunelleschi being in Santa Maria Novella. Stumblingly, he explained that he preferred Donatello's plowman to Brunelleschi's ethereal Christ, which was so slight that it looked as though it had been created to be crucified. With Donatello's figure, the crucifixion had come as a horrifying surprise, even as it had to Mary and the others at the foot of the cross. He suggested that perhaps Christ's spirituality did not depend on his bodily delicacy, but rather on the indestructibility of his message. Abstract theology held no interest for Ghirlandaio. He turned back to his work, the automatic gesture of dismissal for an apprentice. Michelangelo went into the yard and sat in the baking sun, and his chin resting on his chest. He had made a nuisance of himself. A few days later, the studio was buzzing. Ghirlandaio had completed his Christ and was blowing it up to full size with color for the cartoon. When Michelangelo was permitted to see the finished figure, he stood stunned. It was his Christ, the legs twisted in an angular position, a little knock-kneed, the chest, shoulders, and arms those of a man who had carried logs and built houses, with a rounded, protruding stomach that had absorbed its quantity of food in its power and reality, far outdistancing any of the still-life set figures that Ghirlandaio had as yet painted for the Tornabuoni choir. If Michelangelo expected Ghirlandaio to acknowledge him, he was disappointed. Ghirlandaio apparently had forgotten the discussion and the boy's drawing. The following week, the studio moved en masse to Santa Maria Novella to start the Death of the Virgin in the crescent-shaped lunette, topping the left side of the choir. Granacci was pleased because Ghirlandaio had given him a number of the apostles to paint, and he climbed the scaffolding singing a tune about how passionately he loved his sweetheart, Florence, the object of all Florentines' romantic ballads. Up the scaffold went Maynardi to do the figure kneeling to the left of the recumbent Mary and David on the extreme right, doing his favorite subject, a Tuscan road winding up a mountainside to a white villa. Santa Maria Novella was empty at this early hour, except for a few old women in their black shawls praying before the Madonnas. The canvas screen had been taken down to let fresh air into the choir. Michelangelo stood irresolutely beneath the scaffolding, unnoticed, then began to walk the long center nave toward the bright sunlight. He turned to take a final look at the scaffolding, rising tier upon tier in front of the stained glass windows, dark now in the slight western light, at the glowing colors of the several completed panels, the Ghirlandaio artist, tiny figures weaving across the lunette, at the wooden stalls at the base of the choir, covered with canvas, the sacks of plaster and sand, the plank table of painting materials, all bathed in a soft glow. At the center of the church were a few wooden benches. He pulled one in place, took drawing paper and charcoal out of his shirt, and began drawing the scene before him. He was surprised to see shadows climbing down the scaffolding. "It's time for dinner," announced Granacci. Funny how painting spiritual objects can give a man a carnal appetite. Michelangelo commented, "Today is Friday, and you'll have fish instead of bistecca. Go along with you. I'm not hungry." The empty church gave him the chance to draw the architecture of the choir. Long before he would have imagined it, his comrades were climbing back up the scaffolding. The sun arched to the west and filled the choir with rich color. He felt someone staring holes through him from behind, turned to find Ghirlandaio standing there. Michelangelo remained silent. Ghirlandaio whispered hoarsely, "I can't believe that a boy of such tender years can have received such a gift. There are some things you know more about than I do, and I have been working for over 30 years. Come to the studio earlier tomorrow. Perhaps we can make things more interesting for you from now on." Michelangelo walked home, his face suffused with ecstasy. Granacci teased, "You look like a beautiful Fra Angelico saint floating above the paving stones." Michelangelo looked at his friend mischievously. "With wings? No one could call you a saint, not with your crusty disposition, but all honest effort to recreate that which God created originally is a form of worship. Has in it a love of God's universe, else why would the artist bother?" "I have always loved God," replied Michelangelo simply. The next morning he waited impatiently for the first grey ash to sift into the narrow strip of sky over the Via del Benticordi. In the Via Larga, the country people were dozing in their carts as the donkeys and oxen clopped over the stones with their produce for the old market. He saw Giotto's Campanile. He saw Giotto's campanelli standing pink and white in the first streak dawn. Even in his eager rush through the streets he had time to marvel at the dome which Brunelleschi had had the genius to build after the vast space had stood open to the skies and elements for more than 100 years because no one knew how to close it without the use of transverse beams. Ghirlandaio was at his table when Michelangelo arrived. Sleep is the greatest of all bores. Draw up a stool. The boy sat before Ghirlandaio, who pulled aside the curtain behind him so that the north light fell on them. Turn your head a little more. I'm going to sketch you as young John leaving the city to go to the desert. I hadn't found a satisfactory model until I saw you working in Santa Maria Novella yesterday. Michelangelo swallowed hard. After his sleepless night's dream of originating whole cartoons with which to fill the still empty panels.